in the last year, on average, 25% of the salmon that were raised died before they reached harvest. And if you can imagine walking around a field of sheep and seeing 25% of them lying dead in the field, you'd be absolutely outraged. If you want true omega-3s, there's not much omega-3 in a farmed salmon. It's a quarter of what a wild salmon has. But if you ate the fish that they were fed, anchovy or sardinella and sardines, you get so much more good omega-3s. Back in the bad old days, 12 kilos of wild fish had to go to produce 1 kilo of farmed fish. That's when wild fish was abundant and cheap and they didn't have to go to African governments to do dirty deals with. In 2024, many Africans left Africa to go to the EU in search of a better life, of which 10,000 of them died in that process. And they reckon a significant portion of those people that died were fisher people.
Welcome to In Good Taste, the podcast on food matters for food lovers. I'm Malika Basu, food writer, commentator, and advisor. Every week, we bring you sharp, snackable conversations about what's shaping the way we eat and drink across cultures, kitchens, and continents. From big issues to bite-sized trends, it's all on the table. Now, today, we're talking salmon. Salmon is a hugely popular fish on our plates. Crispy skin, omega-3 promise, the easy thing to grab on the way home. Now, there are some challenges with it. I'm joined today by Caroline Bennett, who has spent 30 years helping people eat better fish, long before sustainability was a buzzword. She opened one of the UK's first conveyor belt sushi bars, pioneered ethical sourcing, and knows exactly what's really going on with the fish we buy. Today, she's here to help us make sense of the salmon debate. Well, hello, Caroline. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Nice to be here.
Now, we are talking about salmon today, and you are absolutely the best person for the job, Caroline. We've seen lots of chefs and food writers quietly dropping salmon from menus. Now, could you just give us a little top line on what's driving this shift?
Top line, gosh, where do you narrow things down? I would say it's all down to good work and good efforts by some of the NGO community, particularly wild fish, but there are others that are looking at the environmental and to a lesser extent social, but nonetheless both are intertwined impacts, I think, that are having on the Scottish, particularly Scottish local environment. And I think slowly but surely that's filtering through to chefs and restaurateurs and the like.
And elite food writers, of course. It's quite controversial, isn't it? Let's talk a little bit about the public perception of salmon, because, you have this sort of idyllic view of it coming out of waters, fishermen going out, but that's not really the case, is it?
Oh my gosh, could it be further from, right? I mean, I just look at the statistics to start with. I think so. We spent £1.52 billion on farmed salmon, or salmon in total last year, of which an awful lot, probably, I don't know what the figure is. I should know that, shouldn't I? But I'm sure it's close to 95% was farmed. So you think, that's a massive amount of money behind salmon, and the creators of the farmed salmon are very adept at using their marketing skills to promote their salmon as being a very, as you say, a man on a boat going out with a little rod and picking it up. And they've got these beautiful photos of these stunning lochs in Scotland, and a seal sat beautifully at the back, which is a bit ironic because they have licenses to shoot seals. So yeah, they've created this marvelous story around really the beauty of Scotland, which is hard to do. Scotland lends itself very well to that. But it is you have to consider it is a massive industry behind it. And I think it's that sort of notion that, there are a lot of industrial wild fishers as well, but perhaps not on the scale of the industry of the farm salmon.
The farm salmon.
It's huge, yeah. So 1.52 billion on salmon. The next fish was about half that, well, a third of that, about 500 million on cod. So
That's
we call
cod.
ourselves the cod eating nation. That's what Britain kind of stood by for so many centuries. And it's nearly a third of the sales of farm salmon. So it's
Gosh.
really dominating.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because obviously salmon is the top one of our 5 most popular fish, but also it's making an appearance in some of the weirdest places. I mean, a friend of mine went to northern Brazil and found salmon there. People are buying it in India. These are hardly salmon breeding grounds, are they?
Certainly not. Salmon like cold water. Yeah, they really like that. They live in the Arctic, given half a chance. Yeah, absolutely. No, it is weird, and I suppose this goes towards the fact that the whole world is becoming a globalized, commoditized market. And if you are a chef, or if you are particularly, the dominant chains out there. I mean, McDonald's being a large one, but you think of any of the chains, they write their menus years in advance of publication. With legislation like allergens and that kind of thing, a big chain would never leave it to chance that a chef would come up with a catch of the day recipe for that particular branch. So I think that the growth of the salmon industry goes hand in hand with the growth in industrialized, globalized, commoditized hospitality industries. We've just grown. Back in the day, you used to have lots of independents on the high street. Now you have them all replaced with chains. And chains need consistency. They need certainty. And that's what nature simply doesn't offer. You're going to go out into nature and say, well, we might catch some cod today if we're lucky, but, you target the cod and you get pollock instead. That doesn't satisfy the supermarket's planned sales for the year, and neither does it satisfy the chain restaurants' demand for consistency and reliability, if you like. So I really believe that that's one of the biggest factors driving farm salmon. So it's the prowess, the marketing of the industry behind it. They're very, very good at it. But it's as much a reflection on the nature of demand that now is with us in so many things in the world, right? We want reliable, consistent supply of everything to meet this sort of narrow window of globalized, commoditized industry, where volumes are high and margins are wafer thin. But if you're big enough to have that, it doesn't matter. And so everything's got to work like clockwork, right? You don't want to have, oh, well, perhaps we'll have an expensive fish like cod today, or maybe we'll get a less expensive fish like whiting in. You don't want those inconsistencies. You want certainty.
Well, and that makes, complete sense on one side, but also the impact of that is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. But, we don't think about it, do we? Like, you're coming home late from work, you pop into a supermarket, and salmon is often the easiest choice to make. It's got omega-3 flashing on the pack. It's nice and easy. It will cook quickly, right? And so we don't stop to think about these things. So let's unpick some of this, Caroline. I want to start by asking you in very simple terms. We're talking about farmed salmon. Where does salmon normally live? And sort of versus where we get it from. And I'd love to know the difference between Atlantic and Pacific salmon as well.
So Atlantic, as it suggests, is mostly European. So Norwegian, Scottish, of course, the lochs up there and the rivers are renowned for it. So Northern European, whereas Pacific is essentially Japan, Russia, and Alaska. So you've got that whole, you look at it on a globe and they're all quite close. Farmed Atlantic salmon, it's all Atlantic salmon that's farmed, is given a nice color wash. So you can kind of choose from your Dulux range of pinks, you can just cherry pick your coloring that you're going to put into your farm salmon.
And is this natural coloring? What is it? What do they actually put in it?
Oh, it's called like xanthothin or something like this. I should know things like this. It's a chemical. Obviously it's food safe, but it's something that colors a natural pigment.
And so when we see Atlantic salmon, and that's like really common and people are talking about it. I read an article yesterday with a guy in India who was buying Atlantic salmon. That's essentially farmed salmon, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, in Scotland, it's virtually impossible to find wild salmon. The restrictions are really, the licenses are very restricted. So if you're buying Atlantic salmon anywhere in the world, it's 99% likely to be farmed. Yeah.
Interesting. And I don't think a lot of people realize this, that they essentially buy.
The industry have lobbied hard to be able to remove the word farmed from the labeling. You know, this is industry trying deliberately to do that. Yeah.
And what's interesting about that, I think, is that people don't realize that all of it is farmed. So you would just think Atlantic salmon means it's coming out of the Atlantic, which it sort of is, but not quite, because of course it is being farmed in an open net salmon farm, isn't it? And so could we just explain that? Because when I started looking at that, effectively what I think it is, Caroline, is a cage, a net cage off the coast in the water that contains the salmon. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And you can see them from the air or from the shore. They're sort of round circles of nets. And back in the day, there used to be one or two per loch, but now you can see them stretching out into the distance. So the density, I think, is a real problem for the salmon farm industry. So they try and locate them in high tidal or high flows of water so that they can take the nutrients to and they can take the poop away. So they don't want them in still waters, bracken waters, because that's obviously not going to circulate the water in the needs that they have now. But they are open water, as you say, Monica, and this is some of the problem, because everything that a salmon produces and in the levels of intensity and density that they're stocked, it means that their detritus is significant, and it falls to the bottom of the sea, and the seabed is just a sort of slurry of revolting muck. And if the currents aren't strong enough, then it just sits there and grows, which it does. I mean, it's just so great now that nature can't just naturally remove it. So yeah, it's a problem. The sludge just sits there, and of course, this kind of it sort of turns everything almost septic, if you like. Grow under it. So you might have grass or coral fans, that kind of thing, that are growing underneath naturally, and they're just buried by this mound of poop.
Goodness.
So pretty disgusting. And that creates its own problems. So there's not enough water flow, there's not enough oxygen in the water. And then that can have effects on surrounding habitats and animals trying to live in it as well. So there are plenty of problems in that.
Lots of problems. I wasn't expecting to discuss salmon poop at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, but here we are.
It's a big factor.
It really is. It's down in the dumps. I mean, we could go on forever like this. And that's, really not a pretty picture already that you've painted. But this idea that actually natural habitats are being affected is quite worrying, because I have read a lot about wild fish populations being affected, because the salmon, it's quite hard to contain them, isn't it? Some of them do escape.
Well, I was going to say the poop is just the tip of the iceberg, really, because as well as that, and we'll go on to the escapees, which is, of course, massive. They suffer from parasitic lice. So these large things that just sit on their flesh, and you can, you do a quick Google search and you'll see they look like they've been injured in a war zone or something. It's really nasty. And these parasites, of course, are living and eating off these live salmon. And to combat that, they've put a lot of chemicals into the water. So you've also got the chemical mixing in with the detritus, which of course is held within that poop sludge at the bottom. Then they've got, because the animals are sick, they're putting antibiotics into the water. And that is far better regulated in Scotland now than it is in many parts of the world, like Chile or even Norway. I think they can use a bit more antibiotic than we're legislated for here in Scotland now. But nonetheless, there's antibiotics going into the water too. So yeah, the surrounding animals have to contend with this rather large sludge, the chemicals, and the antibiotic leak. But you mentioned there the escapees, and that, I mean, I think there was something very recent where 75,000 animals, fish, were released into the water in Storm Amy. So that happened about a month and a half ago, was it? In October this year. And a lot of fish escaped into the wild, and this is not uncommon. There are lots of incidences right around the world where these fish escape, and because they're bred, they're triploids for the most part, which means that they've been genetically modified, essentially so as not to be able to breed with Atlantic wild salmon. But nonetheless, there are fish that aren't triploid that do escape, and there was some statistic whereby even if 1% of those escapees managed to breed with the wild population, it would affect something like 750 individual salmons, which sounds like a small amount, but given that there are only between sort of 1 million to 3 million in the wild anyways, it's not insignificant. And of course, if a wild salmon is breeding with a captive one, then all those instincts that we learn about, those extraordinary instincts of the wild salmon where they go out into the deep ocean and then they come back 3 to 5 years later, always to the same tributary, always to the same river. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, this homing instinct that they have in them. And it's tough. You see those leaping salmon, my goodness, you've got belly and you're leaping up this harsh waterfall to get to where you were born. That's an instinct that if that's watered down in any way, that potentially is the end of the line of that breeding line, right? Because they don't have that any longer. So it
really is
a real danger to the viability of the few surviving wild Atlantic salmon.
You've touched on some really important points. I mean, firstly, yes, the salmon industry here in the UK is very highly regulated. And I know the industry often disputes some of the claims, and it is trying to be better all the time. But, there are some things that are they feel a bit coincidental almost, like why are wild salmon populations going down as salmon farming is going up, for instance, which is something that animal welfare activists talk about. And the salmon industry is saying, look, there are lots of reasons why that could be possible. There are other factors involved, but it feels a little bit dodgy, doesn't it, the connection? So some of what you're saying is absolutely landing.
Well, you say it's highly regulated, and it is more regulated here than perhaps in Chile and South America, but it's not highly regulated by a sort of agricultural land-based scenario. In fact, that's one of the biggest criticisms levied at the industry by NGOs, that if this were on land, it simply wouldn't be permitted. And one of the things they point out to is that in the last year, on average, 25% of the salmon that were raised died before they reached harvest. And if you can imagine walking around a field of sheep and seeing 25% of them lying dead in the field, you'd be absolutely outraged. So yeah, they're regulated. There are regulations, but not to the level of land-based agriculture. And I think that's one of the problems. Anything at sea is out of sight, out of mind, right? And I think
100%. That's 100%. And so much of the conversation is around farming. We don't even hear about fishing as much, I would argue. So you're talking now about salmon mortality, aren't you? That's what it's called in salmon jargon, if that's a thing.
Absolutely. Salmon more.
So like one fish dies for every 5 that we get. Is that how it would work out?
And that's in an average. I mean, there was an organic farm last year that lost 87%. So there you go. That's an average. There are some better, there are some worse. I think the average this year is running at about 16%. So there are showing some improvements.
Right.
87% in one organic farm.
Wow. In an organic farm. That is massive. And, you'd never think about that. Imagine one cow dying or one sheep dying, as you quite rightly point out. You wouldn't think. And of course, fish are sentient beings, aren't there? There's research emerging that they can feel pain. I mean, the animal welfare piece of that is just horrible.
I think, yeah, I mean, there's so much research being done on fish now. There's the sentience of them, but I think that's the world is moving towards that. I think we had that in shellfish recently, where your ability to boil a lobster to death is diminished. So yeah, there's definitely evidence of more sentience in animals, for sure. And at the end of the day, they're dying to provide us with nutrition, and we should respect them.
That's so true. That's so true. Land-based salmon farming, that's the other thing you touched on very briefly. And I know that there's been some heavy opposition to land-based salmon farming in the UK. Part of me thinks that's just moving the problem on land, isn't it? But is there a case for maybe better management of things like waste and energy use, pollution, mortality, if that farming then moves on land?
There is an argument for it, for sure, isn't there? If you can contain that water so the pollutants don't contaminate the sea, if you can reduce the amount of sickness by circulating water to be the exact right environment that the salmon need to live in. So there are aspects of it that potentially might work, although there are plenty of examples where it hasn't worked. I think in Florida they lost I think they lost nearly all their fish in overnight when a generator broke down. So I guess we'll get better at doing it on land. It's a steep learning curve, and it's certainly flattening that learning curve. But the single biggest factor for me that it doesn't change, and this is, beyond the environmental side, which already is huge, it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that, and it goes beyond that because we have, as a people in a global developed north, a responsibility for those further afield in developing countries where fish hitherto has been perhaps their only source of animal protein. But what is happening now is that we've run out of our own stocks of small fish. So the herring's been fished out. The sand eels have been fished out. All these small fish that used to be going into fish meal for farm salmon, for the most part, have been fished out in the countries that are producing the farm salmon. So what have we done? We've gone to Ghanaian or Mauritanian or Senegalese governments, and we've said, here, guys, we're going to give you lots of money to be able to fish off your coasts, and big fishing companies have done that. And they're not always big bad countries. These are Irish or Belgian or British or Spanish companies, and they're buying the rights to fish off these continents and taking in massive quantity the bottom of the food chain in terms of anchovies or sardinella, so small sardines, to the detriment of the people living in these communities, to the point where the fishing communities along these coasts have been completely decimated in such a shockingly short time frame. I mean, in about the space of a decade, you've had coastal communities that have been there for centuries and have relied entirely on their local fisher people going out, bringing in the fish in small pirogue boats. So, ones that don't use fuel even, they're incredibly sustainable. And they've managed to sustain an entire community for an entire year just from this one fishing activity. And in as I say, in the less than 10 years, that fishing activity is all gone. And a charity most recently was looking at statistics last year, whereby in 2024, many Africans left Africa to go to the EU in search of a better life, of which 10,000 of them died in that process. And they reckon a significant proportion of those people that died were fisher people. So for me, it's like the West going to the developed world, stealing their livelihood. I mean, as I say, it's often their only source of animal protein. It's not like us where we can choose sheep or beef or chicken or fish. That's all they've got. We've stolen it from them. And then they get on boats to improve their lives elsewhere because their life has gone. And then they're met with opposition from us trying to receive them here, which is all complicated. It's like, well, if we want cheap farm salmon, we've got to expect the consequences of that. And for me, therefore, land-based salmon doesn't make any difference to what I see as being absolutely the key to a sustainable fish. It's just not equitable. It's not robbing fish from small developing countries to feed ourselves. We hardly need more food, right, Malika? You know, we're generally, for the most part, you know, so blessed with such an abundance that we don't even consider how our food gets to our plate.
I mean, just listening to you there, that was quite hard for me, if I'm honest with you. I think it's just morally corrupt. Knowing what we know about the effects of colonization and where it left certain nations versus others, and I do a lot of talking about that, is that we're still doing it. You know, we're still doing it, except we're now no longer doing it as nations. We're doing it as industries that are functioning in food, and essentially as home cooks and food writers, we are enabling these people without recognizing the rounded, full impact of what's going on. So, you know, recently I picked up some news about the fish meal and the fish oils are coming from environmentally sustainable sources, but that doesn't touch the surface of what's going on for an equitable, just, fair society and a balance of food supply. And then if you add to that all the anti-immigrant rhetoric, I mean, you know, where does one even start? It's
so beautifully put. Exactly that. We are no longer colonizing in the name of a nation, but industry is picking up where we've left off. Absolutely. Yeah. It's deeply, deeply concerning and deeply, as you say, unjust, just not right. And if you want to eat well, you do so much better if you want true omega-3s. There's not much omega-3 in a farm salmon. It's a quarter of what a wild salmon has. But if you ate the fish that they were fed, anchovy or sardinella and sardines, you get so much more good omega-3s.
One of the concerns or one of the complaints I hear about salmon from those in the know is that it's dirty. And we briefly touched on that. Now, I don't want to depress all my listeners. Guys, we are coming on to good stuff in a minute, I promise. I don't know if you notice as well, Caroline, I'm in potentially a salmon-colored jumper.
Damn, I'm not. So hydrogen peroxide is one of the measures that is legally allowed, even in an organic salmon farm, I think, to prevent lice, development of parasitic lice that we touched on earlier. So that's one of so they're sort of bathed in hydrogen peroxide. And of course, that disintegrates into hydrogen and oxygen. So environmentally, it's not so damaging. But I mean, goodness knows, who wants a bath in bleach, right? You know, that can't be very good for the welfare of the fish. And genetically modified is something that they've started looking at in America. Of course, it's got Frankenstein fish, and there's some fantastic, Aqua Bounty did this fantastic marketing campaign where they showed conventionally farmed salmon like this big at year 2 against an Aqua Bounty genetically modified fish, Frankenstein fish, same age, like it was like 5 times bigger. And it just made us laugh because it was like, you know, they're promoting this as good. You know, it's like, oof, whoa. So yeah, they are developing. I've not heard so much about it of late. So I suspect industry potentially didn't take onto it. And, you know, because we have fairly strict genetically modified regulations here, albeit they're being watered down by trade negotiations and that sort of thing. It's certainly not taken on in Scottish plants, but it is something that they're looking at.
And I suppose there are also other technological developments underway and afoot, aren't there? I read somewhere that they're exploring certain varieties of grass potentially to feed farmed salmon. So we just need to be aware and engaged in these conversations.
Oh, for sure. No, they say, well, back in the bad old days, 12 kilos of wild fish had to go to produce 1 kilo of farmed fish. That's when wild fish was abundant and cheap, and they didn't have to go to African governments to do dirty deals with. But those fish are few and far between now, if at all. And therefore, I mean, the industry would say, oh, we've become much more green. We've reduced our reliance on fish to feed the salmon, and they have. I would argue that's entirely down to economics. It's become too expensive to find the wild fish to feed to the farm fish. But instead, they've gone to, for example, Amazonian soya plantations or palm oil to sort of beef up. I mean, that's why farm salmon is so oily. It's got loads of oil in it. And of course, that comes from the Amazon. So maybe it's not so weird that your Brazilian friend was eating salmon, actually. They have just as much entitlement as we do. So yeah, that's what they've done. And as you say, there are more developments now. They're feeding them worms, they're feeding them insects. So there are all these potential things that could come out better for the feed. But again, if you were a salmon, you're naturally wanting to eat fish. That's all you've ever eaten in your biological history. So again, is it right that a farmed animal is fed? It's a bit like the BSE crisis where we're feeding bits of beef. It's just wrong. They're grass eaters.
Even natural salmon isn't so natural, is it? Because aren't little baby salmon fed into the wild to help keep salmon populations alive? Is that right, or did I just make that up?
So not so much in Atlantic salmon. I don't think we've learned how to do that yet, but certainly in Alaska, and I think in Russia and possibly Japan, they absolutely, not for all species. So they've not successfully done it for all species of the wild Pacific salmons, but I think pink certainly is. So they're put into hatcheries, and the hatcheries are released into the wild in Alaska. So the difference there is that the hatcheries, they'll produce something maybe that big, and then they're let out in big numbers into the wild. Whereas here, obviously, we're growing them to maturity. So nature, we've done that much of it, and nature has done the rest of it. So yeah, we mentioned this when we were out in Alaska visiting the fishing communities that we subsequently have bought from, and I was interested because most of them didn't think it was a problem. I don't know. I'm not sure where I sit with it, Malika. For sure, enhancing a fishery, because that's what they talk about it. That's how they talk about enhancing a fishery. And you use far less energy. You don't use antibiotics. You don't use chemicals to get something to that stage. So in the wild, most fish don't even make it past. I mean, eggs are incredibly tasty, right? If you're a fish, you find a load of fish eggs, that's what you want to eat. So the rule of the sea is adhered to. If your mouth is big enough to get round something, you get eaten. And so, of course, if you're a very small fish or an egg, you're likely to be eaten. So what you're doing is removing that very large percentage of fish that don't even make it to becoming that size. And because they're only that size, you don't use much feed, you don't use antibiotics, you don't use chemicals. You don't even need that much space because they're tiny. So I don't know. I mean, Alaska seems to be doing quite well. They absolutely ban farmed salmon, so they don't allow farmed salmon at all in Alaska. It's far too damaging for their potentially beautiful, pristine environments there, and their industry with Pacific salmon is huge. So why jeopardize it? But they do enhance. I don't know. I don't really want to fall down on that's good or that's bad. But Atlantic salmon, that doesn't happen to my knowledge. It's only Pacific salmon.
You've explained that incredibly well, because of course there are trade-offs everywhere, aren't there? I mean, people are making these decisions. Is it right to do this? And sometimes there aren't any right or wrong answers. It's just we have to look at the entire, conversation and make an education-informed decision, which I think is the problem with salmon, is we're not making educated, informed decisions. So now on to the really...
Just to say that, Malika, you are the only person who has ever asked me about hatcheries in salmon. So that to give you a measure of how ill-informed. And I was talking to an academic recently who was talking about farm salmon, and even she didn't know. So there you go.
Wow, gosh, well, that makes me feel,
You're
I
well
don't know,
researched.
well researched. I'll take that. But I was quite gobsmacked to in fact discover that when I was writing my book. Well, that's good to hear, I suppose. Moving on to the really practical bits now, Caroline, is that, for people who still want to eat salmon despite knowing everything and appreciating some of the challenges, is there a kind of good and bad and terrible, or is it just bad and less bad?
Depends what you're looking at, right? If it's farm salmon, I would say it's pretty much all bad. I just don't. I mean, even the land-based, for the reason of the feed, I just don't get my head around it. It's not fair. It's not just. In my opinion, once you've eaten wild salmon, it's like, why would you eat farm salmon? Farm salmon just tastes vile. It just tastes of the Amazonian oil that's gone into it. It's just, it's flabby and horrible. That said, we can't all switch. We can't go 1.52 billion pounds worth of farm salmon into all eating wild salmon. There just simply isn't the population in the wild there to sustain that. So I would say, rather than of our top five species of fish that we're eating in the UK, it's always salmon. Just say, well, okay, maybe I'll eat fish a bit less than I do, which of course goes against all the government advice to do it, but that you try different species. So we just have to diversify our eating habits. Try species that you've never tried before. I think that's got to be the answer, because if we're all just going for this commoditized, reliable, consistent product that's always the same size and always the same cooking technique, it's, we're trying to square nature. It can't be squared. It's wild and exotic and fantastic and unpredictable, and it doesn't suit our needs to get to a supermarket, buy something quickly and come home and cook it.
Sure. Any thoughts on trout?
Well, trout, for the most part, has similar problems on the feed. It's fed the exact same thing as the salmon. It's produced by a company called Screeting, and they produce 99, not maybe 99, but a significant amount of feed that's used globally, whether it's in Europe or in America. So the trout is fed the exact same thing. I think the trout has a little bit more resonance with maybe land-based salmon. You can contain the water and the environmental impact much more readily, but it doesn't square the problem with the feed.
And what about organic salmon? Because it takes away some of the issues, doesn't it? Not all, of course, with the feed especially.
So organic salmon is better in a few ways, like the stocking density, but the feed, I think they're struggling with. The demand is outstripping the supply.
Gotcha. And finally, I suppose the labels, do we need to watch out or look out for anything? I know they're not foolproof and fail-safe, but are they at least a measure?
Well, there's so much controversy around the labels. So there's lobbying to so, for example, in America, you're legally not allowed to mention that it's genetically modified on your salmon labeling. So the industry has fought so hard for it to be illegal to say whether it's been genetically modified, which is quite extraordinary. Here, they tried to, so one farm lost the right to put sustainable on its labeling of late. So that's good. The NGO community galvanized support from legislators to say that they could not use the word sustainable on their labeling. But yeah, farming in itself is, as you say, it's not labeled clearly enough. It might say it on the back, but it doesn't put it on the front. So yeah, labeling tells you a little bit, but not a huge amount. But it's usually the back label you need to look at rather than the beautiful picture on the front.
Well, and the fine print, which of course is virtually impossible to read, isn't it, when you're busy and rushing around. Sounds like, we really need to think about the salmon on our plates, Caroline. So thank you so much for coming along and sharing your deep insights on the matter.
It's been a pleasure, Malika, especially talking to someone with so much insight into it in the first instance is great. Good on you.
Thank you. If you enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, tell all your friends about it, and I'll see you here for the next one.